by providing sound information. Oh, that's good. I'm going to talk about some project we've been doing trying to improve cochlear implant listening by providing sound information that would usually be poorly transferred through the implant using vibration, tactile stimulation on the wrists. And the main aim of my talk today really is to try to convince as many people as possible that this is a really, really interesting area with a lot of potential that we should be putting more energy and resources into investigating. And this is also the argument I make in the partially obscured paper reference at the bottom of the slide there. I'm going to try and use this down here. So that's also the case I tried to make in that paper, which came out a couple of weeks ago. So if you want the long form version of the argument I'm about to make, that's the place to go. And it's open access, so easy to get hold of. Right, so the fundamental challenge that the cochlear implant faces is trying to transmit the sound information that in a healthy cochlea would be transferred by around 3,500 hair cells. It's trying to transmit that same information, but now using at most just 22 electrodes. So it's got an incredibly tough challenge on its hands. And as probably pretty much everyone here is aware, it's remarkably successful considering it's working under those quite extreme constraints. But there are a couple of limitations that have been highlighted already. So one is that cochlear implant users tend to struggle to understand speech when there's a lot of background noise, tend to have issues with spatial hearing, so locating sounds in space, separating out sounds coming from different locations, and also, as we mentioned a lot already, issues with music perception. So that's the focus of my talk today, and of course the focus of the conference more generally. So what I'm calling the traditional approach to try to overcome some of these limitations is to try to get more sound information to the brain through those implant electrodes. So that could be clever microphone techniques like beamforming to focus the beam of the microphone towards the sound source of interest and suppress sounds coming from other directions. It could be clever signal processing techniques to try to pull out the most important parts of the sound, or it could be techniques to try to improve the interface between the implant and the brain to try to make sure we're getting as much information through as possible and as cleanly as possible. So, of course, all of these techniques are extremely valuable, but there is a fundamental limitation that they all hit up against, and that's that there is only so much sound information that is possible to transmit through the brain, through to the brain when you've got such a small number of electrodes. So the alternative approach that I've been advocating over the last couple of years is to see if we can, rather than trying to get more information to the brain through the implant electrodes, could we provide some of the sound information that the implant isn't able to provide? Could we provide that to the brain via another route? And the other route that I've been experimenting with is the sense of touch. So this is what we've been calling electro-haptic stimulation. So the electrical CI signal combined with haptics, with vibration. I'm not the first, we're not the first people to have the idea of trying to transmit sound information to the brains of people with hearing impairment. So the earliest example I know of a device is way back in the 1920s, Robert Galt's teletactor. There was some focus on this in the 1980s as well with tactile aids and early 1990s. But there's a couple of key differences here. So one is that we're looking at augmenting the implant signal. So we're not trying to use this as an alternative to the implant. We're trying to augment the cochlear implant signal. And another key difference to the last time this was really seriously focused on within auditory sciences, as I say, back in the 80s or early 90s, is the technology available. And that's moved on ginormously since that time. Basically, every key technology that you'd be interested in for this sort of application has moved on ginormously. And I'll come back to that a bit later. So our main focus so far in this project has been on trying to enhance speech and noise performance and sound localization. And we've got some really promising results that I've highlighted up here. So our focus all the time in this work is we are doing lab-based testing, but we're always keeping an eye on translation to the real world. Because we obviously are keen to ultimately translate this. So for example, with the speech and noise work, we're always extracting the haptic signal from the speech and noise signal. We're not just taking it from the clean speech. We're using signal processing methods that could be applied in real time on a compact device. And we're presenting that stimulation to the wrist, which we think is a realistic site that you could use in the real world. And I'll come back also actually to the sound localization stuff in a moment. So we've got two projects looking at this at the moment, both funded by the William Demant Foundation. So we have this one that's ongoing, the one I've mentioned at the top there, So our main focus in there is on speech and noise performance, but Jeremy and also Scott are focusing on music in that one, and they're both presenting today, I think. And then we have another one that's about to start up with Peter, who's presenting tomorrow, and Bjorn, who I think has got a poster here as well. So we are sort of, I am putting the William Demant Foundation's money where my mouth is, as it were. So what sound information could we provide that the implant's struggling to provide? Well, an obvious first one to think of is pitch information. So something that's come up already. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this study because we have a poster on it by Sam Perry, so poster number 5. So if you're interested in this, please go and have a look at that. But in brief, what we did is we built a device that had motors up the wrist, up the forearm rather. And what we do is we map the fundamental frequency, so effectively a pitch, an acoustic correlate pitch, we map that to place on the arm. And the reason we do that is that one of the reasons we do that is that the tactile system is pretty poor at discriminating different frequencies. So we're mapping pitch frequency to place on the arm. And using that approach, and as I say, do go to poster 5 for more details, we managed to get pitch discrimination down to 1%, which is really, really good. And we also managed to show some robustness to inharmonic background noise, so down to really quite low SNRs. So hopefully I've at least with that slide managed to convince you that there might be something interesting in here. We could potentially be providing some quite high resolution pitch information. Okay, so what about intensity? Well, this is somewhere else. I think there's an opportunity to provide some of that, what I'm calling missing sound information. So the dynamic range available through tactile stimulation is around 55 dB. So this is true of the palmar wrist, so the underside of the wrist, the dorsal wrist, the back, and also up the forearm. So each of those sites, you have around a 55 dB dynamic range available. That compares to around 15 dB for electrical CI stimulation. So you've got a bigger range available. Within that range, how many intensity steps can you discriminate? Well, you can discriminate around 40 different intensity steps for tactile stimulation, which compares to around 20 for electrical CI stimulation. So some potential there, I think, to provide some intensity information that's not being well, not getting through well at the moment. So what I just described was intensity discrimination for stimulation at a single site. What about across sites? What about across the wrists, for example? Why might we be interested in that? Well, one reason we might be interested in that is that we might be able to transmit some sound localization cues. So one of the key sound localization cues, intensity differences between the ears. So if the sound's over to the right, louder in the right ear than the left ear, because your head gets in the way, over to the left, louder in the left ear than the right ear, because your head gets in the way. So maybe we could transmit those sound intensity differences to tactile intensity differences across the wrist. Another reason this might be particularly good for music is that musical instruments in a mix are usually mapped left-right into space just by amplitude panning, just by intensity differences. So that perhaps we can take advantage of some sensitivity across the wrist. So we measured how sensitive are you to tactile intensity differences. So TID here stands for tactile intensity difference across the wrist. And we had a younger group aged 20 to 30. We had an older group aged 50 to 60. So not horrifically old, but marching on a bit. And then I also have a dotted line there that's showing you the performance of young normal hearing listeners to sound intensity differences between the ears. And one of the first things you can see quite strikingly is that the sensitivity is really quite similar. So the sensitivity to intensity differences across the wrists is similar to auditory intensity differences across the ear. So that's quite encouraging, I think. What you can also see is that we don't see any clear decline with age, at least for people up to the age of 60. So that's also quite encouraging. For comparison, for bilaterally implanted CI users, CIs in both ears, you would expect intensity differences of around about roughly 4 dB to be their threshold. So they'd be literally off the chart on this one. So some potential there to provide some missing sound information, I think. So can you use this to locate sounds? So we did this experiment as well. So we're taking the signals behind each ear, we're projecting them down to vibrations on the wrist, get cochlear implant users into the lab, unilaterally implanted. Half of the participants also had a hearing aid in the other ear, were bimodal. They sit with the loudspeaker ring around them and they're asked to locate where the sound came from. They do that with audio alone or with audio and haptic stimulation together. And what you can see on the plot over to the right-hand side, what that's showing you is the amount of error they make. So the bigger the bar, the worse. They're further out with their report of where the sound came from. And the first striking thing you can see is that there's a lot of error when it's audio alone compared to when it's audio and haptic together. So a couple of things to note here. The audio only performance in our group was actually quite good compared to other studies. So we had a particularly good set of participants in terms of performance. We still get this ginormous improvement. The level of performance they reach is similar to the level of performance you'd expect from bilateral hearing aid users. So that's really encouraging. And this is after next to no training. So there's potentially more benefit to be gained here as well. So hopefully some managing to convince you that there's some indication that there's some information there we might provide that cochlear implant users may not have access to at the moment. Okay, so what about temporal cues? Well, this is where things get a little bit more tricky. So cochlear implant users, as I think Bob mentioned, already pretty good at basic rhythm perception, tempo and meter perception. There is some evidence that cochlear implant users maybe perform less well when rhythms become very complicated. Gap detection thresholds, another way of estimating the temporal precision of the system. Well, cochlear implant users have very good gap detection thresholds, only slightly worse than normal hearing listeners. Tactile system, very different story. So gap detection thresholds tend to be worse, and tactile signals tend to be more susceptible to masking from sounds that come before or after. So temporal precision of the tactile system isn't as good as the CI. So I don't think we're going to be able to, I can't think of an obvious way at least that we could enhance temporal precision of cochlear implants by providing information through the tactile system. One thing we might be able to do, and this is a pure speculation at this point, coming back to that complex rhythm perception, maybe if we could help segregate out different sound sources within the rhythm. So say the snare drum was over to the left, the kick drum was in the middle, the hi-hat was over to the right. If we could help segregate out the instruments, maybe that might help with complex rhythm perception, possibly. As a speculation, maybe something to be looked at. But it doesn't look like there's obvious ways that we could enhance temporal precision. Okay, so I've sort of been sneakily assuming so far that we've been able to sort of deconstruct the musical mix into different instruments, which is obviously a ginormous assumption. How might we do that? What methods are available? Well, the methods we've been using and others have been using for haptic approaches so far, I don't think are likely to be suitable for music. So the pitch method that I discussed earlier, that assumes there's only one harmonic sound. Well, you can't always be assuming that for music, of course. The work we've done on speech and noise so far is assuming a positive SNR, so that the speech is louder than the background noise. Another big assumption that we probably can't make for a lot of music. So those methods probably aren't going to be suitable. So we're going to need something beyond that. There are some promising machine learning approaches, and this is not an area that I'm an expert at all, but this paper that I cite here is really, really good for assessing how good the different methods are for pulling out different instruments effectively from a musical mix. So they recommend these approaches, non-negative matrix factorization and multi-layer perceptrons. They have another paper following this one, the same group, where they implement them in real time. So on the real-time point, a couple of things to note. I think one is that we've got more design space around the wrist than you'd have behind the ear. So we can potentially get away with more heavyweight signal processing because we can use more heavyweight processing chips. So that's a key thing, I think. And then another thing is because it's music and sometimes it might be streamed, we might be able to get away with algorithms that are maybe near real time, so have a slight delay. Possibly, maybe a bit optimistic, we might be able to, in some cases, look ahead with algorithms, that kind of thing. So we might be able to use some more advanced techniques here, possibly. And then there's other approaches that I think are going to be talked about more in this session, possibly. So things like spectral complexity reduction that could be looked into as well. Okay. So just to finish up, I'm just going to try and give you a picture of the systems that are out there at the moment. So I review that in this paper as well. So I was actually quite surprised how many systems there are that have been developed for enhancing music perception with vibration. There's really quite a lot of systems out there, mostly developed in music and engineering departments. So you have systems for deaf raves, which are basically just ginormous loudspeakers pumping out a load of low frequency energy that's shaking your body. You have vibrating floors, more medium scale systems like chairs, like the one I'm showing up in that picture there from Queen Mary University, jackets, suits, then smaller systems, gloves, sleeves, bracelets. So there are a lot of systems out there. What's really missing, in my reading of the literature at least, is any studies any really nice controlled studies of how much benefit these are giving to things like music enjoyment. So there's not controls for things like just novelty and placebo effects, and even often not controls for the fact that you can probably hear the low frequency from the system. So some important controls missing. So I think that's something that needs to be added. And there's also a lot of technology that I think is not yet being exploited that could be here. So this is one of the things that we're going to focus on really quite intensely over the coming months with Sam as well, is trying to develop a device. We're trying to develop a wrist-worn device, which I'll show you a 3D model of in that picture there. So we're going to be developing that device, and we want to try and take advantage of as many of these key technologies that I alluded to earlier as possible. So the latest haptic motor and driver technologies, partly to make sure we're getting really faithful signal reproduction. So I won't go into the details, but techniques like active braking and overdrive that help us get really nice, precise signal reproduction. Automatic calibration, so that's for the amount of pressure being applied to the motor. You can do automatic calibration routines for that kind of things. That could make quite a big difference. And then these host of technologies that are already being exploited in hearing aids and cochlear implants. So the latest microprocessor technology, the latest wireless technologies like Bluetooth low energy that allow now multiple simultaneous data streams, for example. So you could be streaming across devices or between devices. Manufacturing and fast prototyping techniques like 3D printing, battery technology. There's all these technologies, and as I mentioned, that have moved on ginormously since this was last really focused on in the hearing sciences. Okay, so just to summarize, I've tried to argue that I think there's strong potential for us providing some of that, what I've been calling missing sound information, so pitch, intensity, sound location. I've speculated that maybe there might be a possibility of helping complex rhythm perception. I've highlighted a couple of signal processing approaches that might be worth looking into. Also highlighted the weak evidence base at the moment for some of the current systems. And then I've also finished by highlighting a couple of what I regard as the really significant technologies that we could be exploiting. Right, a couple of acknowledgements, and then I will stop talking, Jeremy, I promise. So I want to I thank Ama, who was really important to us getting this project going. Carl, who was also extremely important, really supportive right from the start. Soren, without who I probably wouldn't have an academic career at all, let alone be doing this project. Robyn, who did the sound localization work. Jana, who did the work on thresholds and intensity differences. And Sam, who did the pitch work and who's becoming increasingly critical to the project going forward. So I thought I mentioned him to keep him sweet. Here's some citations from the project. Everything is open access, so easy to get hold of. I will just, as the last things I say. So these papers down here, this one is all about music perception. It focuses on that. The one down from there is very much about speech perception, and reviews that and is targeted mostly at audiologists. And then the bottom one is a much more technical review of the technologies available for us developing a device and that kind of thing. So it's more of an engineering focused paper. Thank you very much. I shall take your questions.
That question would be too much. We were on time.
Oh, was I?
Sorry, that's my bad. So do we have questions?
Yeah, really interesting talk. I had a question about if we know what part of the body is best for tactile stimulation, and if there's been any studies for like maybe a footwear, you know, like for example, like Evelyn Glennie like talks about how she uses her whole body,
yeah,
almost like hear sound. So has there been any look into that at all?
Yeah, so there is quite a lot of work on that. So a general sort of rule so when you say best places, so in terms of sensitivity, the rule is basically the fingertips are really sensitive, and you get less sensitive as you come to the center of the body. The feet are really sensitive, and as you come to the torso, it becomes less sensitive. In terms of spatial resolution, so how much spatial difference you need to be able to tell it's two separate sources of stimulation. really sensitive at the fingers, but then you haven't got a lot of design space on the fingers. And then you become, again, less sensitive. Abdomen is really not very sensitive, more sensitive towards the extremes. So hopefully it gives you an idea at least of yeah, whereabouts in the body might be useful.
We got a question online.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Lorenzo Piccinali. So he's saying, related to the intensity differences, do the devices on the arms need to be calibrated carefully, including careful positioning, in order to allow such high intensity difference precision? And was training needed in order to get the values you reported?
So we didn't actually do very much training. Thank you, Lorenzo. It could be even better than I showed, because we didn't train people. And when it comes to auditory intensity differences, training seems to make a difference. So we may be underestimating a bit. I will take that point. In terms of the precision of wear on the wrist, I mean, we had them using the under part of the wrist for that study, and we didn't see any obvious, if it's just whereabouts here, it didn't seem to make very much difference. We haven't assessed that formally, but we haven't noticed any high sensitivity to slight movements of the contactor. I mean, we're using a 1 centimeter diameter contactor, so it's quite large. But we've no reason to think that if you shift it slightly this side or that side, it makes too much difference. And then I mentioned the automatic calibration thing. Pressure probably does make a difference, but we can hopefully correct for that in the device. Bob's trying to ask a question, but I want to vote on Brian as well.
But maybe Brian, there's someone behind you.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm a bilateral cochlear implant user, and I'm not particularly excited about the haptic technology. I'm just wondering what evidence you have that cochlear implant users specifically are excited about the technology, because I don't feel I want any more devices on my body.
You mean have I got cochlear implant users coming up to me and saying I want to go? Is that what you mean by excited?
I want to try it.
Yeah, I mean we get a lot of.
I'd love to try it.
Yes,
I'm not excited about it.
Okay, so how can I help?
Yeah, you're in a cochlear implant symposium, but
Yes.
Instinctively, I would think this technology appeals more to the culturally deaf, or as much to the hearing aid users as to cochlear implant users.
Yeah, so I think there is definitely a big case to be made for people without cochlear implants who are profoundly deaf. I completely agree with that. So in terms of like more devices, one of the reasons we went for the wrist is that we're trying to get towards a device that wouldn't feel so much like an additional, people wear Fitbits already. It could be quite similar to a Fitbit. It could be quite discreet. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big deal as a thing, it's strapping on the body or anything like that.
I'm slightly guilty because I do use a haptic metronome,
Right,
a
okay.
wrist-mounted metronome for music, but not to be able to dance to it or anything.
Well, hopefully one day I can get you into the lab. I can show you it, and then I can talk you around that way.
I think it's time for the next presentation.
Well, I'll talk to you.